Chimney.
Today is December 2nd, 1986. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Bertha Mildred Day in Leedy, Oklahoma. Ma'am, where were you born?
I was born in what was known as the Trail community. It's about 6 miles northeast of here.
And when's your birthday?
November the 10th. 1907 when I was born.
1907. Who was your father?
Tom Twineman.
How do you spell Twineman? Twineman.
T-W-Y-M-A-N.
And your mother?
Maud Allen, before she was married.
A-L-L-E-N. And where are your parents from?
My mother came from Throckmorton, Texas. She came with her folks here in 1896. And my father was born in Illinois, but his family came from Canterbury, England in 1874. And they settled in Illinois. We're not sure just exactly where, but that was where he was born. Then later the family moved to Missouri, Tipton, Missouri, I believe.
When did they move to Missouri?
I think he was only 6 or 8 years old at that time. 76 or probably in 80, the early 80s.
And when did they move to Oklahoma?
My father was 24 years old when he came to Oklahoma, and he filed on a piece of land out there in this trail community.
Did your parents talk about the trip to Oklahoma?
Yes. There was several children in the family. George Allen was my grandfather's name. And they was bringing, when my grandmother drove a covered wagon, and when their oldest son drove they called it a cart, and their biggest problem was the Indians. They were afraid of the Indians, and they ran out of water one afternoon, and so my grandfather got on a horse and went on a few miles farther to see if he could find water. Well, he ran into an Indian camp, and he told them they was out of water, but they wouldn't give him any, so they had to go back, and my mother said they drank some tomatoes. They had canned tomatoes, and they drank the juice off those that they made out that night. And early the next morning they started out, and they didn't go but a few miles till they come to a big lake of water. But there was lots of hardships along the road. They started made this trip in November because my grandfather wanted to vote for William Jennings Bryan, and he knew if he came before that he wouldn't get here in time to vote here, so he voted there before they came, and the weather was getting cold, and they were 3 or 4 weeks on the trip up.
Now, was this coming from Texas?
Mm-hmm. Throckmorton, Texas, close to the Brazos River.
Why did they come to Oklahoma?
My grandfather had been on several trips of taking cattle to Dodge City, Kansas, from down there in Texas. And they'd come through here. It was called the Chisholm Trail then. And on one trip, when he got back to his home there in Texas, he told them he'd found the land of paradise, and he wanted to move here. These trail flats were a picture out just 6 or 7 miles northeast of here. It's just a flat place, not very. It's only 4 or 5 miles long, but at that time it was all covered with grass, and these men that had brought these cattle up here, they just thought that would be an ideal place to live.
Did your grandfather talk about the cattle drives?
Yes, he did, but I don't remember too much about them. But I know they'd be gone a long time, you know, they just drive these cattle and they'd eat grass as long as they came, because, well, they weren't in railroads at that time, you know, and they just had to drive them.
Where would the cattle drive start? What part of Texas would they?
Well, I'm not positive about that. I just don't remember him saying just whereabouts it was in Texas, but he'd made several trips through this part of the country.
Now, was he in the Civil War, your grandfather?
Yes. Or that is, his family, well, he was only 12 years old when, well, I don't know who you'd say it was, they came and burnt their home, killed his parents, and he climbed up in a tree and escaped, and that was the way he escaped being killed. But he saw their home burnt and his parents killed.
Where did they live at that time?
It was in the very eastern part of Texas, I believe.
Now, was it the Northern Army, or was it just a band of bushwhackers or whatever?
I'd say it was a band of bushwhackers. And he started out then, he was only 12 years old, on foot, and he came to, it was called the Self Sheep Ranch. And he got a job there and worked there several years, I think, but there was where he met his wife. Debbie Ann Self was the daughter of the owner of this ranch, and they were later married then.
Where was the ranch?
Well, I'm not positive about that. It's close to Throckmorton, Texas,
Okay.
along the Brazos River. Now, that's just all that I remember about it.
How long did he work on the Self Ranch?
Let's see. They were married. He worked there till they were married. I'd say it was in about 1876 or 8.
And any idea how long he was on the Chisholm Trail making the cattle drive?
No, I don't. We children have often thought that we wish we'd asked Grandpa more questions about it while he was alive, but they're all gone now.
And he filed on land up here at Trail Flats?
Yes,
And how large was his claim, his homestead?
160 acres. And I think he traded a team of horses and a wagon for that piece of ground.
What kind of house did he build on the farm?
It was a half dugout.
How large was the half dugout?
It had 2 real large rooms in it. And then later on they built 2 rooms onto that on top of the ground.
The part above the ground, what was it made of?
It was made of lumber.
And your father was a rancher?
You know, he worked when he first came to Oklahoma, to the Trail Flats. He was about 24 years of age, and he worked for several men. One of them was Jim Medlin, and Matt Jones were 2 ranchers that were out there on the Trail Flats at that time, and he worked for them for several years before they were married.
How close, were your parents neighbors? They settled in the same area on the Trail Flats?
Well, yes. In this, what was called Trail Flats. I took down
As a small girl, what chores did you do around the house?
Well, as soon as I was old enough, I helped milk. We milked our cows by hand. We separated the milk. And At that time, of course, there was no electricity or running water, and we used coal oil lamps for light. These chimneys had to be cleaned every day, and wicks trimmed, and the lamps filled. And
how'd you clean the chimneys?
we just washed them with soap and water and dried them good.
Ever break a chimney?
Yes. Yes,
What happened? Was it hard to replace a chimney at that time?
Not at that time, no, because everybody used them. Then we either burnt coal or wood for cooking and for heating both, and there was always kindling to bring in every evening, and coal or wood to bring in to keep the fires going.
Did you do laundry?
Yes.
Tell me about doing laundry. How'd you do it?
Well, we used a rub board, and we had no tin boiler. At that time, that we boiled the white clothes on the kitchen stove, and we just rubbed the clothes on a rub board, and we wrung them out by hand, and everything had to be dried outside, if at all possible. Sometimes we just had to dry things inside and finish drying them inside.
What kind of soap did you use?
Lye soap that my mother made.
How did she make soap?
Well, we butchered our own hogs, you know, and after we rendered the lard, we had cracklings that, by putting lye with these cracklings, and so we made soap out of it. It had to be boiled, and then made soap.
Where did you start the school?
At Trail.
At Trail? How large of a school was it?
At that time, it was a pretty good sized school. However, we only had 2 or 3 teachers, but they'd be several in a class. I have a school picture that was taken when I was in the 8th grade, I think, and they was probably 75 or 80 students in it.
Would you tell me what kind of games you played in school?
We played blind man's buff and hide and seek, and I don't know what you call it, ring around the rosy or thing. And of course, all of the ball games were outside basketball and everything. We even had an outdoor basketball court. We had games with other schools, but they were played on outdoor courts.
And how far did you go through school?
Well, I went, at the time I was ready for high school, that wasn't, Trail wasn't accredited high school, but we could go there most of the term. We came into Leedy for about the last 6 weeks of the term, and we would get our credits. And I finished, went through all 12 grades out there at Leedy. Or Trail, I mean. So.
Was there any organized efforts in school to support World War I during the war?
You know, I just don't remember about that. I do remember seeing the first airplane
When was that?
World War I. It had to been in 18 or 19, something like that. I remember the teacher took she let us all go outside and watch this plane as it came over, because that was really something to us to see an airplane.
Why was the airplane flying over this area?
I don't remember whether they were training men for the air service or whether they were carrying some kind of cargo. I just don't remember. But I do remember that was my first airplane, to see my first airplane.
Do you remember Armistice Day, the day the war ended?
Yes, now let me see. I didn't want to get it mixed up with the Second World War.
That was November 11th, 1918.
Yes. Yes, I think they rang bells everywhere, and if I remember right, schools were dismissed that day. Of course, we didn't have the communications that we have nowadays, and of travel or getting word to each other either. But I remember that everybody was so happy when that armistice was signed.
Do you have any other stories about your childhood? Any specific stories that you remember?
Well, I might say for entertainment, as we grew up to be teenagers, we would meet in different homes and have singings. And, all the music that we had then in our home was records played on a phonograph that you had to wind this phonograph up by hand, And then later on, we got the radio. We thought that was really something when we got a radio. And but now, of course, the TVs didn't come on till a long time after that, after I was married. My family growing up. I remember on Sunday afternoons, after cameras or Kodaks, we calling them, came in to use, a bunch of the young folks would go in buggies on Sunday afternoon and take pictures of things, over the community. We had pie suppers to raise money for the school and have programs. We used to have spelling bees and ciphering matches too at the school.
Did you have literaries?
Yes, we had literary.
Now, what is literary?
Well, that was more like they gave readings and stories, and I'd say it was a whole lot like these girls. Well, you weren't there this afternoon. These girls gave some readings. It was more like that, if I remember right.
Was it something like a Chautauqua?
Well, the Chautauqua was a more advanced stage. They had more like plays, at the Chautauqua.
Does the Chautauquas come to this area?
Yes, here at Lady, yes, they did. I come to them.
What would a Chautauqua consist of? What?
I don't remember how many players would be in, but I know they'd have an afternoon performance and a night performance, and it'd be more like plays and music with it, singing and.
They weren't local people, they'd come in.
No, yes, they weren't local people, they had come in with it.
1920s.
Well, I was married in 1927, but I finished school in 1926, and at that time, Trail was dwindling down. Trail had built up, it was a booming town. It just almost overnight when the railroad came through in 1911. But by 1920s, there wasn't anything but a post office and a grocery store and a depot and an elevator, I think that was left.
I forgot to ask about the flu epidemic of 1918.
That was really bad, and we lost a lot of people at that time. It was such a bad winter, and there was so much snow, and we had a doctor or two here in Lady, because they had to go by in a buggy, or a horseback, and we didn't have the antibiotics and things that we have now, and it just took the lives of a lot of the community.
Who were the doctors at that time?
Dr. Seaby, W.E. Seaby, I believe, and Dr. Allen. I can't think what Dr. Allen's given name was. Dr. Seaby, I think, was the first doctor here in the... And when a person died with this, it was hard to even get them buried. The snow was so deep, and you had to go with a team, and wagon to, and sometimes the bodies had to be kept for several days before they could get to a cemetery to bury them.
Would you give me a good description of a flapper?
Well, you know what my opinion, what I think of when a flapper is, they wore the dresses real short. The knees are a little above, and they were tight skirts, and they wore real broad brimmed hats, and their dresses were long waisted.
Were there many flappers here in Leedy?
I don't remember that. Now, I'll tell you, at that time, I didn't come to Leedy very often, you know, because we had to go with the team and wagon. But now that's just my opinion of a flapper. She was very, I can't think what word I want to use, but she wasn't bashful a bit.
Did you bob your hair in the 20s?
Yes.
What did your parents think of it?
Well, I think they had come to the conclusion it was all right then. Some of my other sisters too had the haircut.
And you were married in 1927?
7.
Where'd you meet your husband?
Well, we lived together out there in the trail community. Both of them, we went to school there and known him all my life.
And what's his name?
George Dennis Day.
And what kind of work your husband do?
Well, he farmed. We just had 160 acres, and we raised cotton and wheat and corn, and we raised cattle and hogs.
Now, did you do any work with him in the fields?
Well, yes, I didn't do as much work in the field as some women did, but I helped, like when they'd be gathering corn, they gathered it by hand, you know. I have driven the team as we went down.
You ever pick cotton?
Oh, yes.
How many pounds could you pick in one day?
I don't know whether they ever got 100 or not, but I didn't make much money off of it.
How many gins were there in Leedy?
I just remember one gin.
You know who ran the gin?
Not to begin with.
Was it McKinney's? Or no?
It seemed like there was a Blackburn, was there?
Blackburn's boss at tomorrow.
It might have been McKinney's, I don't remember for sure.
When the people first picked cotton, at first they had to pick it out of the burrs, and then you couldn't get much, then they picked the bowls.
Snapped it with the
Yeah.
cotton.
Could you give me a good description of early day Leedy, what the town looked like?
Well, by the time I was a teenager, the time I was married, there was several business places here in Leedy. There was a garage, and I think we had 2 grocery stores.
What were the names of them?
The garage. Ed Smith was one of them, had a garage.
What were the grocery store names?
There was J.R. Mullins had a grocery store, and then later on Tiny Roberts had a grocery store here.
Were the buildings, were they wooden, brick, or
Yeah.
what were they?
Mostly wooden.
Were the streets paved?
I don't think so, not to begin with. No, they weren't paved till quite a bit later on.
What were the streets like when it rained?
Muddy. With ruts in them. And we had a theater. And the folks that ran the theater also had we call it a little cafe now, and you could buy chili burgers for a nickel, milkshakes for a dime.
What were their names that ran the
George Smith.
George Smith.
He was known far and wide for his chili recipe.
Yeah. And also he made taffy candy. And
How bad were the dust storms in this area?
Oh, they were terrible.
What does a dust storm look like when it's approaching?
Well, just a real dark cloud. I can tell you when it was in the early 30s. It started in the afternoon, on a Sunday afternoon, with black clouds just rolling in, and it just really got dark. Chickens would go to roost. It got so dark, and it scared lots of people. And I know some people went to cellars because they was afraid there was a tornado in it. But it was just this dust storm, and dust settled on everything. You had to wipe your dishes out if they was in the cabinets. You know, the film would just get settled on everything. And by Monday morning, there was a gray film all over everything. When you, even your tracks, it showed in this gray film, and that was dust that had come in from some other states.
Is that what they call Black Sunday?
Yes. Yes, that was called Black Sunday.
Did you try to keep the dust out of the house?
Yes. Now, my youngest son was only 6 months old that spring, and he took pneumonia. And we run blankets out of water and hung over the windows to keep that dust out as much as we can, because it was so hard for them if they already had bronchial trouble to breathe that dust.
Ever get stuck out in a dust storm?
I don't think we did, but now up here in the Panhandle, over here, I had a brother living up there at that time around Eva, Oklahoma, and the dust got so deep that they couldn't hardly drive a tractor over it. The dust would cover up the tractors almost, you know. Of course, in here, if you get in the fence rows, it'd be half or 2/3 way up the fence rows, you know, just dust that had blown in.
Did you and your husband consider going to California in those years?
No, we didn't. We stuck it out.
Did many people go to California?
Well, I don't think there was so many right here that went. We heard of a lot of people that did, but not right here in this community.
What were you doing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor?
But that was on a Sunday afternoon, wasn't it? We had been to one of my sisters for had eaten dinner that day. We were on and we heard it over the radio that they bombed Pearl Harbor. It was terrible news, and then since then, a few years ago, I got to visit Hawaii and saw where those ships had been sunk.
Did you do any work for the war effort in World War II?
Let me see it. Was that was in World War I, where they made bandages and knit things for the soldiers. I can't remember in World War I what we did. I just can't remember now.
In 1947, the big tornado came through that hit Woodward. How close did the tornado come to Lady?
Came through here. He had a terrible one here.
Was that the same storm that
No.
hit?
It was a different storm, but it came through in 47, in May of 47.
What happened?
Well, it blew the biggest part of Lydia away.
Where were you when it hit?
Well, we were living out there on our farm north of Trail, and we had telephones then, you know, and well, we had some of our sons was in Lady, and the telephone went out. You couldn't call anyone, and we was afraid something had happened. And you know, my husband, he just had to walk about half a mile to one of the neighbors, and several of them went together and went in and found out that what had happened. But my son, well, he was going with a girl that lived here in town. She was in the south part of town, and they weren't damaged, weren't hurt, but it just tore the biggest part of Lydia out.
Anyone killed?
Yes, several.
I thought there just one man.
Just one
That's the
man
man
that
that poked
built
him.
the big cellar.
He went to center and poked his head out to see what was going on.
No, he stood in the store. I think he stood in the
Yeah.
store.
The baby.
Well, was that another tornado then that, there was the bakery man,
Uh-huh.
What was his name?
Abbott.
He wouldn't build the cellar.
What that? Well, I was thinking that there was 2 or 3 others that was killed at that time. Wish my memory was working better. But anyway, it was terrible, and it took a lot of cleaning up. We have some pictures at home. Well, they're in their historical book. How it twisted the water tower. It just twisted it like a twister rope up and laying on the ground.
Have any big floods come through here? Through Leedy?
Well, not right here in Leedy, but down south here at the Washita River there was. That was in the 30s too, when it was so dry, and we'd been having dirt storms.
What caused those dirt storms?
Well, it seemed like they said that a lot of the pasture land had been plowed up at that time. And I don't know whether it was because the wind was worse then. We were just having terrible winds, and I couldn't say exactly what did cause them. It was so dry too, we just hadn't had enough moisture to settle the ground for so long.
Okay. Do you have any more stories about your childhood? Anything that you remember in particular?
I remember one thing, of course children at that time didn't get many toys for Christmas. Our folks usually made what presents that we got, but one year in particular, I had gotten a doll with a china head on it. She told us about it, and there was, you'd make the body, and buy these china heads and put on. I was so proud of that, and on Christmas morning, we were going to go to one of my aunts for dinner, and of course we went in a wagon, and it had steel rims around the wheel. Steel rim and wheel, I guess that's what you go. As I was getting in the wagon, I had this doll in my arms, and I hit its head against that steel rim and cracked its head there the first day I had it. But well, we didn't. Children in those days didn't expect toys like they do now, and they just weren't on the market. You didn't see them. Now then, children see these toys on TV and everything, and they want them. But our mother would make clothes for us a lot, and make the girls dolls, and she made shirts for the boys and coats. And
What was the biggest holiday of the year?
well, I don't know whether you'd say, but we used to celebrate the 4th a lot more than we do now. We'd have community picnics and gatherings, and everybody would take a picnic lunch and gather at a certain place, and the men and boys would probably play baseball in the afternoon. They'd have different kind of games. But just to pick out one in particular, I don't know, it's probably be the best. Of course, I know Christmas always was.
Did you do anything for Halloween?
Yes.
What did you do?
As the boys were older, we didn't do like they did now. We don't go around for trick or treating like children do nowadays. But boys got older, they always tore up something. Usually they have these outdoor toilets, you know, and they was always upsetting those, or taking one of them and putting it. I know one time out there at the Trail Schoolhouse, they put one in the, had it right up on the front steps the next morning. They also put a cow inside the school building in the hallway. People used to try to want to be home on Halloween night because they was afraid they'd have company and they'll tell them what would take place.
Tell me things that you did on Halloween.
Well, I can't remember ever doing anything in particular myself on Halloween.
Nothing mischievous.
Yeah, yes. That just seemed to be the main thing on Halloween, was to try to do something if it wasn't, turn something over or put something where it wasn't supposed to be, you know, move things around.
Well, do you have any?
You know, one of the things that, you know, when we went to the Christmas trees, they hung everything on the tree. We'd have our dolls on the trees. If the men got lanterns, they were sitting up there, you know, whatever you took to the tree. I mean, they hung it or set it up there. You just took odd things like that, you know, that we wouldn't.
Oh, I can tell you about one Christmas out there in the Trail Schoolhouse. I don't remember now just how old it was, but at that time, they used live candles on. They'd be smaller, you know, they just have dozens and dozens of them on the tree. It was a real flame. Then they have these dolls, and at that time, women wore wool scarves. They were called fascinators, all different pastel colors. They just be draped over it. And there was those live flames, and we always had this tree up in the second story. And if there'd been a fire, it'd been terrible, but it wasn't long till we had this terrible fire down here at
Bad switch.
and so then they passed a law, you know, you couldn't have a real candle, which was very good. I thought of them.
Well,
You said something about a Hereford cattle, did you?
I just wondered how you got into the registered cattle business, but you said it was much later, and that
Yeah.
Charles, your husband, didn't have that. It was mostly your son.
No, it was Charles's project. He had gone to school at Stillwater, took animal husbandry, and that he wanted to raise Hereford cattle, and that he still does. That's what.
well, how many children do you have?
Four boys.
What are the names?
Bobby, Eddie, Donald, and Charles.
They all live in this area?
And no, the two older ones, Bobby and Eddie, live at Clinton. Bobby was an engineer, area engineer for the Soil Conservation Service for years. Well, he retired 2 or 3 years ago. He'd been in there for 35 years. And the next son then works for the Soil Conservation Service, but he also has a little piece of land of his own. He raises, he doesn't have the registered cattle, he just buys calves and fattens them out. My third son, Donald, is a professor at the University of Illinois. He teaches agriculture engineering. And Charles never married, he's still there on the farm, lives with me. My husband's been gone it would be 11 years this next spring.
Well, I want to thank you. We had a good interview.
I'm sorry couldn't answer more questions.
Oh, that's fine.
Did well. Oh, wow. Yes.
Every morning. And then I know a lot of time we'd run out of soft water, and we had to break our water in
With lye.
Yeah. Use lye soap then.
Run out of soft water.
Cistern water.
Cistern water was
See, the cistern didn't go dry.
You must not have ever tasted it.
No.
Yes.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, they have it.
I still use it. I still use it in my house. It's so much nicer even than our rural water. So
Well.
we use it for washing. I do my laundry with it.
Do you put a softener on it?
No? Oh, I don't have to. It's cistern.
Oh, your sister?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I thought you
Yeah, we
meant
have
your-
a huge
I thought you
cistern
meant
off
your
of
set.
the.
I thought you
Oh.
meant your jip water.
No, we still use the
Oh.
cistern water in the dishwasher
Uh-huh.
and are we being paid? Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. This is December 2nd, 1986. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mildred Blair Hunt in Leedy, Oklahoma.
But
Ma'am, where were you born?
Well, I'm from Camargo, but my address isn't Leedy.
It's not.
No, it's Camargo.
Oh, you're, okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you live in Camargo.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
I was born in Putnam, Oklahoma.
And when's your birthday?
June the 17th, 1904. I'm older than she is.
Who's your father?
Ivel Melville Blair.
Iva?
Ivel, I-V-A-L. M-E-L-V-I-L-L-E is the way he spells it.
And your mother?
Grace Emma Herring.
Last name was?
Herring, H-E-R-R-I-N-G.
Okay. And where were your parents from?
They originally came from Nebraska and Iowa.
Now, your father came from?
I don't know which one. Nebraska, I think.
Okay. And when did they come to Oklahoma?
Well, it was in the early 1890s, but I don't know exactly what. I know it was in the early part of that time.
Did they tell you stories about the trip coming to Oklahoma?
Well, not too awful many. My mother was young when they came through, and then my father was older. And they didn't tell us too many, only they had a hard time getting everything done and all.
How'd they travel to Oklahoma?
There was a caravan of wagons, came down, and because there's several in the family came besides my folks. My husband, my dad's folks and my mother's folks came in the same caravan, but my mother was younger. She was quite a little younger than my father. And he said that was where he courted my mother on the trip from down.
And where did they settle?
Settled out east of Putnam. I don't think they ever homesteaded. But the rest of it down, there's a lot of the others that did. Well, there's one farm down there, I'm thinking, that a Herring that homesteaded on it, and it's still in the Herring name.
That's probably milk.
No, it's Uncle Art. It's
Oh.
a different,
Arthur.
different, one of the brothers. My mother's, well, Milt Herring's father was my mother's brother too.
Any reason why your parents settled around the Putnam area?
Well, I guess just because about the first place they came that they liked it where they could get land. See,
Why did they come to Oklahoma to get land? Is that the reason?
I think that was they came to Oklahoma on account of the economic conditions back there.
But you said they didn't homestead.
No, just my father. Now I don't know, but now the rest of them did. My mother's people all homesteaded.
So did your father's family just?
Yes, my father's mother and his stepfather, they homesteaded. But I don't ever remember my father telling about homesteading. I know he lived on the farm a long time up there, but I don't remember him telling that he. And I even have the patent that my grandfathers got for theirs.
And so your father was a farmer, correct?
For a while.
For a while.
For a while. We lived out there till some of the older ones, well, all of us but one was born in Putnam. But the older ones got ready for school, and there was no school in Putnam. So we moved to Thomas, so we could all go to school.
And what year did you move to Thomas?
Well, I don't know.
How old were you?
Well, I hadn't started school yet.
Do you remember doing any chores on the farm before you moved to
No.
Thomas?
Well, we lived on the edge of town in Thomas. That's later on, though, of course. And I always had to do the boys' work.
Tell me, what kind of work you had to do?
Well, I tended to the hogs and pitched hay. And tended to the horses. Because I just had one brother, and he was younger. And I was the stylist. So that's the reason that I did chores.
Did you help your father butcher homes?
Yes, some. I didn't like that though, so I didn't do that.
What kind of crops did you raise there?
Well, now see, I don't ever remember of us living on a farm at all. We just had this place at the edge. And I know that I never did pick cotton like some of them said, unless there was some of them we wanted to go to a picnic, and they had to pick cotton before we could go. Well, we'd go and pick cotton so they could go on picnic with us. But now my father never made a living. He went into the machinery business. He worked for the Minneapolis Moline thrash machine people. And that's what he did. He sold machinery. And he was a collector a while. And then we moved to El Reno. He had to move to El Reno then. And but the way we moved there was he'd load the cows and everything in boxcars. And you go on the freight train.
Why'd you move to El Reno?
That was where his headquarters were for the Minneapolis people.
Now, did you do the laundry at home?
Yes.
Tell me, how did you do it?
Well, we just filled the kettles full of hot water, and on the board. I have an old board now that my mother used, and she did she did the most of the washing. Us kids would always do something else. But when we went to school and we came home and she had the overalls on the line, we knew she was through. But it took her from early in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon to do the washing. And then the next morning her hands would be so swollen from wringing the clothes she'd hardly close them.
Did you have the big black kettle outside that you built a fire?
Built a fire. That was in the summertime especially, and in the wintertime we did it in the house.
What kind of soap did you use?
Well, like homemade soap is all I know. Lye soap.
You ever make soap?
No, I never did, but my sisters had, but I didn't. Because I didn't establish my home though until later, and you buy laundry soap.
Did you ever render lard?
Yes, I've rendered lots of lard, and I've cut it up, and
How do you render lard?
we'll just put it on the stove. And well, you have to cut it up in small pieces, and we used to grind it. And then sometimes if we didn't have a grinder, we just cut and then put it on the stove and let it cook. And then whenever the cracklings were so brown, well, it's done.
Now, what do you mean by cracklings?
Well, that's the fat that doesn't cook up.
And how long does it take to render the lard?
Well, according to took you quite a little while. Of course, we tried to use a big pot. If we had one of those big iron kettles and we had a lot, we'd put them in that. Be just according to the size of your vessel. It took quite a little while to do it. And you prided yourself in seeing if you could render it and it still be snow white. We didn't want a bit of brown in it.
And then you had to store it in buckets.
And then you had to store it in buckets.
And
then in preserving your meat, that was one way we preserved the meat was we fried it, what they call fried it down. You'd fry your meat and then pour the grease over it to preserve it. And that's the only way we had to keep it. We didn't know how to can it then. We learned that in home
demonstration.
Well, that's when we called
Yes, that's what it was then. Now it's
home economy. Extension, yes.
Did you know your grandparents?
Well, yes, I knew of some. My grandpa and grandma Linville. Now on my father's side of the house, my father's father stood guard in the Civil War in the rain. Now this is the story that they told us.
What's his name?
It was A.M. Blair is all I know. In the Bible, all it gave was just A.M. Blair. And my father was just 4 years old. And then his mother remarried and married him after she lived a widow 14 years and then married a man by the name of Linville. And then, so we didn't know we knew his mother, but not, then we knew his grandpa and grandma and mother's folks.
Yeah. Tell me the story about standing guard in the rain.
Well, that's all that I know. Just that he stood guard in the rain in the Civil War.
Now, are those the Linvilles that are still in Putnam?
Yeah.
Kin to them?
Owen and Lewis and them.
What side was he on, north or south?
Well, I imagine he was on the north side. I don't know because they were in Nebraska. I've never heard of them saying that they were to the south. So I don't know.
When did you start school?
I started in Thomas.
And-
No. I started in El Reno. And then I came back to Thomas when I was in the 6th grade. Then I finished in Thomas.
Would you describe El Reno in those years when you lived there?
Well, that was, we lived, I don't know anything about the first part of it, because I see when I was 6th grade when I left there, so I wouldn't remember too much. Only that we lived out in the edge of town, and we always had horses. And my dad raised hogs. That's one way he made his living, in connection with his other. We'd feed out hogs, and then he'd peddle them in the wagon, peddle the meat out in the wagon. And I'd go with him sometime. And I remember one time going with him. We were in the colored town, and a colored lady came up wanting to know if we had any chitlins. And I didn't know what a chitlin was. So I learned something there. But then that's the way he made his living for a long time, was feeding out the hogs and peddling them. We raised corn. We had a 5-acre tract that we planted the corn. We always kidded Mama and told her that she just had that because we suckered it, we weeded it, then we gathered it, and we hoed it, and we always kidded her and told her that she just did that so we'd have something to do. And I imagine that's it.
It kept us pretty busy.
Yes, it did. And we always had one horse that outrun the other, and we had lots of fun riding our horses.
Yeah, tell me about your recreation in the early days.
Well, that was one thing. At that time we had horse, but we always played ball. So there's enough of us that we played ball, we played black man, and always there's a batch of kids around. Shouldn't have called them a batch, I guess, but they were kids.
Came in batches almost then.
That's right. And of course there was enough of us. There's 5 of us, you see. There's 5 girls and 1 boy. There's enough of us that we could play a game without having to call in the kids. But we lived on the edge of El Reno, so that gave us places where we could get away from. We had always had lots of picnics in our days too. So that.
Could you describe Thomas in the early days?
Well, it was just a good little town. Of course, we lived kind of in the edge of town there too, and that's where we had hogs and our horses. And I remember he's talking about water. We had a well that had one of those long buckets, a long bucket that had a dipper, a thing in the bottom, and you drop that down in there, and then that water raised it up. And then we were so little when we was doing it, we'd have to jump off the curb around the well in order to have strength enough to pull the water up. And then we'd go, we had to help bale hay. And my bud and I, we never worked together. We always worked together. But every time we worked together, we made a game out of everything. And we'd see which one could throw a bale of hay the highest, or we could see which one could bust a chunk of wood in the least licks. And that's the way we entertained ourselves. We always had a game of going. And so it wasn't work. So,
And did you go through high school?
yes. And I got my teacher's degree. When you could get a 2-year certificate, no, not the 2 years. I got a life certificate, what they called it. It's 60 hours of college work. But my life as a teacher on that certificate didn't last very long. Because I had to go to school again. But I taught several years.
Where did you get your 60 hours?
From Weatherford.
Weatherford.
Mm-hmm.
What year did you go to Weatherford?
It was I taught in 25 and 26. It was 24. I graduated out of high school in 23. Went to school in 24, a full calendar year. Got my 60 hours. And then I taught in 25 and 6 and was
You
married.
graduated from El Reno High School.
No, I graduated from Thomas.
Would you talk about your life at Weatherford, going to school there?
Well, they didn't have dorms in those days. We lived in private homes. They made place for it. And I lived with elderly couple.
What was their name?
I don't know. And I worked from a boarding room. That's what it is. And I didn't have much money because my folks didn't have too much. And I borrowed enough for my tuition. And we just had a big time. I remember that I didn't make too awful good a grades, but I never did flunk, so.
Now, were there flappers at Weatherford?
We didn't have enough money to be a flapper. We just had to wear what we had.
But were there other girls there that were?
Well, I don't remember because the ones that I knew, had much to do with, they were in the same financial state that I was in, so it wasn't. But I worked from a boarding room, and what little money I got was my folks sent to me. So.
And who was head of the school at that time?
I don't have any idea.
And after you got your degree, where'd you go?
I taught there at, after I got my, the first year I taught in Caw City, Washunga.
No, Washunga.
That's just a little place there, close to Caw City. It had several Indians, and I met my husband, and we were married.
How big was the school at Washunga?
Well, it wasn't very big, just a grade school.
Was it a one-room school?
No, it wasn't a one-room school. There was different grades. I think I taught third and fourth then. Taught mostly Indians. And my father was working over there in the oil field, and he got me and my sister a job there. That's how come we got over there.
What tribe were you teaching?
Caw City. The Caw Indians.
Caw Indians.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get to know any of the Indians over there?
Well, I've some. I have a brother-in-law that was an Indian on my husband's side.
What type of Indians were the Caw?
Well, they weren't wealthy like the Osages, but they seemed to be pretty decent people. And then I have one brother-in-law that is a Wyandotte. And he's a real hard worker. But they had to work for what they got. Of course, they depended on the call money if they got any, but...
The Wyandottes, they're on over for east, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I don't know where they're in Kansas City, I think, somewhere else. That's where they moved from first.
Yeah, I think they're way up northeast.
Yes, I think so too.
Around Miami.
Off up in there. That's right.
Do you remember World War I?
I wasn't too old though then, but then I remember some. I remember when it was over, because Thomas had a big blowout one night. Come to find out that wasn't the right night.
Tell me about the celebration.
Well, all I remember was that they built a big bonfire and the people was all downtown, and that's it.
Did you do any knitting or wrap bandages?
No, I didn't then. I did sometimes, but not for World War I, because I wasn't old enough. I think I was only in the 7th or 8th grade then, you see. But it must have been in the Second World War that our missionary group made bandages.
Tell me about the dust storms.
The what?
Dust storms.
Well, now, I can remember the one she was a-telling about that evening. One of my boys had the pneumonia, and they called it dust pneumonia. It was on Sunday afternoon, and that did come into with a black cloud. And my father-in-law was here, it was my house, and he came and said, let's go to the cellar. I've seen lots of things, but that is the worst that I ever saw. And when that went over, you couldn't see a thing. And we'd get up one morning with white dirt in the house, next morning maybe it'd be red, the next morning it'd be black. But now I think what caused that dust storm is just because it was dry. And the farmers didn't farm then like they do now. See, that was
erosion. They just didn't terrace and they didn't take care of their land.
Yeah, and I think, and then's when they put in that shelter belt of the trees. Planted that.
Did you do any work with the WPA?
No, I didn't. But there was a lot of work done at that time. But see, I had a family then, and I couldn't do that. I know that they had the garden there in Camargo, and we'd get A lot of them, I mean, they furnish everything. You see, to can the vegetables. The women had a garden, and the WPA furnished the stuff to can it with, and they did it. Then they gave the food away.
How did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, it was rough, but it wasn't like, we didn't have it rough like a lot of them. We always had a job. We never made a lot of money, but we always made enough to keep our own family.
Now, what kind of work was your husband doing?
Well, he worked during the worst part of the Depression. He was working at a filling station, and he was making $10 a week. But now that $10 a week, we didn't have to pay rent. We had our house didn't amount to much, but that was enough by us raising, having our own eggs and our own milk, and canning. We could live on that $10 a week. Then there was, we had 4 children at that time. But we never were without some kind of a job.
Would you tell me what type of meals you fixed in the Depression? Or how did you stretch your food?
Of course, we had lots of beans. And I never wasted anything. I'd mix it into something, and they didn't know what I was doing. They didn't know what was in there, so they just eat it. But we didn't had some kind of a dessert. I tried to have lots of fruit. And I know with our apples, of course that was later on too, but we always had an apple a day, but I just limit them to 1 a day. And same way with servings of meat. I had limited them to 1 serving a day, because I told them that was enough to keep them healthy, and then we could have it every day. And that was the way we managed it mostly. And now most of what the biggest trouble was refrigeration. See, for a long, long time we didn't have any kind, only where we'd hang it in a cistern, or if a farmer had a water trough, he would run the water, set his stuff in there and run the water around it. Then we finally got to where we just could buy ice. We got an ice refrigerator, and you could keep it there. But the milk, we had to hang it in a cistern or somewhere to keep. That's why they claim so many babies were sick, because we didn't know how to pasteurize it, and we couldn't refrigerate it. See, after we learned to pasteurize the milk, then that was lots better.
Of course, they milk twice a day, and so you could have fresh milk pretty often.
But I had one lady tell me, she said if she lost a child or 2, in their food, she said, if I had known as much as you folks do now, I wouldn't have lost my babies. And then we learned how to mash up the food and give it to them. Now that was through the extension department too. We learned a lot through it. So, but there's lots of people around there that had a lot of trouble. On the WPA though, we got lots of work lots of buildings done, lots of things
What
worked.
type of buildings?
They built on the schoolhouse. Our waterworks was built by the WPA. And my bud was, he had just finished Stillwater. He was an electrical engineer. And they wanted to put in the water system, but they said they had to have an engineer. Well, Bud's little certificate, and Mr. French's, that's the man that lived there, his experience working with men and building things, got him, and then another man was the politician. We got it. And they dug it from about 5 or 6 miles north, dug the ditch by hand. But now they had to work, all the men in the area, you see. A lot of them from over here, not there and all. And that's how we got that. So that was a good deal there. And then what my husband did, he was, in that time, was on gravel, sand and gravel. There was 2 or 3, he was a pumper on one gravel pit, and then the others, he would run the crane, and then finally when that played out, they hauled a lot of gravel for the roads and gravel for the bridge, the river bridge. And then that was later though, when he got the job in the bentonite mine.
What year did you all move to Camargo?
in 1930.
And why'd you move to Camargo?
Well, we came out to visit, but we stayed. My husband worked in the oil field over there in Osage County. Well, it played out like it did here. So we came out here to visit. My sisters were here. And he got a job, and so we just stayed.
What part of Osage County was he working?
At Call City,
Call City.
in the Osage, over there in the Osage field. That wasn't the name of the field.
Burbank?
Yeah.
What type of work was he doing in the field?
In the oil field, he worked on pipelines. He was the one well, I can't think of it. Anyway, they laid pipe, and he was the one, they did it all by hand, you know. He was the one that pounded out the rhythm for the men to screw in the pipe. You know, he had a hammer man. The rhythm.
I've never heard that one.
Well, that's what they used to do. Because, you see, there's one band here with putting in another one over here, but they had to pull together, you see. And he had to keep them in. He called it slapping collars, but I don't know what that's
Slapping collars.
slapping collars, I don't know.
What about World War II?
Well, I had 2 sons that was in it. And my husband just liked one day of having to go. But we had a family then, a big family. But my 2 older boys went. And
Where did they serve?
one went to the Navy, and then the other one served in Germany. And
They both came back?
yes. And the boy that was in the Army got out, but the ones in the Navy stayed and retired. He's retired out of the Navy now.
You had 6 children, and then
Uh-huh.
you adopted the other 4. Now, when was that?
That was in 49. Yes, we had 6 of our own and 4 adopted ones.
Did their parents,
Mhm.
were they killed or were
No.
they ill?
No, the mother died with the effects of the birth of the twins, and then the father had Hodgkin's, and then they died within hours of each other. He had been sick a long time, and they were in California, and they said it seemed like when she went, well, then he just turned over and gave up. But we got the twins though before they passed, the 4 before they passed away. And the twins were just 3 months old. So you see, they're the same as mine, all of them. Well, we finally adopted them too.
And did you do any work during World War II for the war effort?
Well, I don't think so. No, I was too busy then, I guess, with the kids and everything. Well, we didn't have an opportunity where we are to do as much, you see, as they did in the bigger places. So, that was one of
Do you
them.
have any? Okay. Well, we have a good interview.
Well, wait, I'd add one more
Okay,
thing on there
okay.
too, that Herb not only invented, but he helped. I want to bring in Mr. Fisher from
Okay.
Woodford, because Herman worked for him for years, building elevators, these concrete elevators, and then you run the vent mine for him. But if it hadn't have been him, we'd have never been able to have financed the children. That'd have been all right.
Who's this Mr. Fisher?
Luther Fisher from Woodford. Runs a Fisher Grain Company up there.
Did he develop the Bentonite
Yes,
mine?
yes, he's the one that started the Bentonite mine.
Now, what is the Bentonite mine? What is that?
Well, it's a volcanic ash, and it comes in layers. It's real white with no sand in it, and it comes in layers, and according to how much dirt's piled on it, and they strip mined it, and they shipped it to Jackson, Mississippi, and they make it's in face powder for one thing, but that's a minor thing. It's a drying agent. They said that they packed equipment and stuff that they want to ship. And then too, you know, in some things you put a little white package of stuff, well, that's bentonite. And this is white, where there is pink, but now, and the pink, I think, or some of it is lower grade. This is supposed to be in real high grade bentonite.
Is the mine still operating?
No, when the railroad quit, they had to quit. But they are opening it up, trying to again. costs too much to ship it to Jackson, Mississippi. It's too much moisture in it. See, by truck, if they truck it. So that's it. But Mr. Fisher let him work. I mean, he paid him his salary whether he was working or not. So that's one reason we got along. Whenever you have 6 little ones, all at once, 4 big ones and 6 little ones, takes a lot of money.
Takes a lot to rear them.
Okay, thank you. Again, this is December 2nd, 1986. This is Joe Todd, an interview at Fern, Graft, Crispin, and we're in Leedy, but you live in Putnam.
Right.
Okay. Again, give me your birthday.
December 5th, 1911.
1911. And who is your father?
Charlie B. Graft.
And your mother?
Mellie A. Miracle. M-E-R-I-C-A-L.
And how do you spell the first name?
M-E-L-L-A.
M-E-L-L-A.
L-A.
L-A. Okay. And where'd your parents come from?
My father came from Montague, Texas. Montague County, Texas. St. Joe. And my mother came from Franklin County, Illinois.
Now, you told me a story about your mother on the trip coming
Yes.
down.
She
Tell me the
came,
story again.
there was quite a caravan. Some of her brothers and sisters, of her mother's brothers and sisters came. And there was quite a caravan of them, and some of them were driving mules and some horses. And when they came to the Mississippi River, they had to get on the ferry. And she was about 7 years old. And she said the horses, when they got out on the middle of the river, the horses began to neigh and the mules were braying. And she was really frightened and was glad to get across and on the ground again.
And she was, what, scared of the water? Or?
Well, just the noise and the confusion of the horses.
And how long did the trip take to Oklahoma?
I think they were on the road 6 weeks.
Anything else happened on the trip that she told you?
No, I can't remember any details that she had mentioned.
What about your father coming to Oklahoma?
He had lost his father was in the service of the Civil War a short time. And I think he was only in 30 days, but during that time he was already built up to a sergeant. And shortly after the Civil War, he died. And my father was, I think, about 5. And then there was, my uncle was 4 years older than he. And then they came on from Montague County up to south of Duncan. And because my father's half-sister lived there, and her husband, the one that had been in the Civil War and lost his leg. And he ran for office and held an office there in the county. I've forgotten what county Duncan is in.
Stevens.
But Stevens. And he held an office there for many years. And when Dad was about, I think he was about 20 when they came then to Oklahoma.
Okay. And so your father settled around Duncan and your mother settled around...
Well, when she could, no, when, of course, he was only, probably about 10, and they lived there in the time he was about 10 to 20. And then Mother came from Illinois, and I think that was about 1894, and they settled in the Elm community.
Now, where is Elm?
Well, it was about 16 mile, no, it's farther than that, it's about 20 mile northwest of Custer, mostly west. They had a post office, and they had a switchboard there. That's where the telephone, they had the switchboard for the telephone.
And you mentioned that your father drove cattle from Duncan to...
Yes. My uncle came first, my Uncle Dick and his nephew. And they came up and established a home in a dugout. And then the man that they bought the relinquishment from had, he had hauled these big logs. He'd cut huge cedar logs and he hauled them down, had hauled them. But in the meantime, he decided he'd had all he wanted of Oklahoma. So he left, and they put the logs together. These were great, huge cedar logs. And in the summer, there would be bumblebees would burrow holes in those logs. And when we would go up to play, well, we would get a shingle and a baking powder can, and we would see who could swat the most bees and put in their baking powder can.
You told me that you had a great-grandfather killed in the Mexican War.
Yes.
What was his name?
James Martin. And he had come from Tennessee to Illinois. And he and a son volunteered for service, and both were killed, in the father and the son. He was killed at Jalapa, Mexico. And then there were, I think, about 8 children at home beside that.
And where was the son killed?
He was killed at a different area in Mexico, but he was also killed in Mexico.
Do you have any information about them at all? Or?
Nothing, only that just where they were killed. They volunteered and to enter the service, I suppose because of difficult times, and thought they would get paid some.
Did the family move to Texas after that?
No. Now this was my, a part of them did. Some of their children, Leonard, one of the girls, my grandmother's name was Ann Miracle, or Ann Martin, and she married this John Miracle, and they had been here only a short time, not too many years, 8 or 10, and he died. But now her father was the one that had been Ann Martin. That was her father that was killed in the service, and they lived in Franklin County, Illinois, and had come to this area.
Well, that's basically all. I wanted information on the early part of the family, and I think.
I beg your pardon?
I think we have enough here because
Yes.
we have with your brother, I think.
Uh-huh.
I wanted, especially the stuff about the Mexican War.
Right. Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.